So my family has a long history of working for the Fairbanks family, but I'm not a Fairbanks myself. But yeah, the November talk is about non-Fairbanks who lived in the house, including servants. So
Which there are quite a lot of them people
Yeah.
really aren't aware of.
Yeah, right up until around 1800, the Fairbanks could afford to have 2 or 3 servants at a time.
In that little house?
Yeah, that's what we would call an attic. They called the garret. That's where they lived, in the attic.
Well, and also remember that house back then was enormous.
Yeah, for
I mean,
1600s, that's a huge house actually.
Wow.
So I know there's a second floor, is there a third floor?
Well, yeah, this is the garret, which is sort of a 3rd floor.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
the
sort of
attic.
that point there.
Yeah.
In that roof that's sloped
Yeah.
like that somewhere?
Well, no, that's the lean-to, the back of the house. But
But yeah, the attic, the garret was
Yeah.
a very narrow space and very. But they also might have had farmhands who would have lived in the outbuilding. Because they weren't all
yeah, probably
necessarily
by the
close.
1700s, they have an outbuilding with more farmhands and they living up there. In the 1600s, the house servants lived upstairs. Anyway, actually, that sort of brings me to this, which is nice. So the Fairbanks family. To start, since we're talking about farming and food, let's talk about the farm first. So this is a map of the original town of Dedham overlaid with a current map of Dedham. And you can see the Fairbanks family have this red square is the Fairbanks family's original property. And the red dot there is the location of the Fairbanks house still. So East Street was the original street through this part of town. And people were encouraged, so what happened was when you were admitted into Dedham, if you had a family, you got 12 acres. If you were a bachelor, you got 8. And there's at least one record of a bachelor getting his 8 acres, then finding a wife, getting married, and they give him another 4. So they got upgraded if they got married. But the Fairbanks showed up here with 6 kids, so they got the 12 acres right away. But the 12 acres were in a roughly 1 acre wide by 12 acre long strip. With East Street, at least in the part of town the Fairbanks lived in, East Street going down the middle of it. And so you can see that all these houses have land either side of East Street. But you were encouraged to build your house as close to the road as possible, so that everybody gets their 12 acres, but nobody's more than an acre or so apart from their neighbor. So if there's a fire, the neighbors don't have too far to run to help you, or if you were ever attacked by natives or the French, which never actually happened in Dedham, but they were ready for it, you wouldn't have too far to run to get cover. So yeah, that's the Fairbanks property there. That's the original farm. So initially the Fairbanks weren't farming as a living. They're woodworker. Jonathan's a woodworker. So Jonathan and Grace being the original couple that gets the property with their 6 kids. So Jonathan's a woodworker. They're only farming to support their own family. They are making enough food that they probably don't have to buy any from anyone else. So they're making their own food, and then they're making their money by Jonathan built spinning wheels as a specialty.
Did they come right from England or did they?
Yeah, so they were from Yorkshire, England. They got to Boston somewhere around 1633. Spent time in Boston and Watertown while they were figuring out what they were going to do, and then they're admitted into the town of Dedham 1636, have the house built 1637.
So when you say admitted, you had to apply?
Yeah, Dedham was very much what we would call a gated community. It was meant to be built by and for Puritans only. Which is interesting because the Fairbanks aren't actually Puritans, but they are Puritan-ish. And Jonathan has that useful skill set. He knows how to build a spinning wheel, and none of the founders of Dedham knew how to do that. So they figured, well, at least he's Puritan-esque, and he has a skill set we need. Okay, fine.
The northern part of that, does that go up to Whiting Avenue?
Whiting.
I know where east is, and then if you go to Nassau High School,
Oh yeah, east,
and then go
oh,
straight
Whiting's
up.
right here. Yeah, Whiting's right here.
Yeah, that is one.
And then Eastern was added
I'm
later.
just wondering, my house is part of their farmland.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, original Fairbanks.
Yeah, so this is the original 12 acres, but it expanded quite a bit over the years. First off, you'll note their fondness for J names and their originality. So Jonathan is the original owner. He has 12 acres. By the time John gets it, he has somewhere between 80 and 90 acres. But John also actually gets another property in Rentham that's at least the same size, and it's a cow farm exclusively, as far as we can tell. So when John is writing out his will, his oldest son, John, gets the property in Rentham, the cow farm. And then his second son, Joseph, gets the farm here in Dedham. And then all three Josephs here keep the farm roughly the same size. The third Joseph sells the house to his younger brother, Ebenezer. Ebenezer also doesn't expand much, but then Ebenezer Jr. kind of overdoes it. He's actually responsible for most of the additions onto the house, but he also doubles the size of his father's land holdings. And so the family hits a rough patch right there, in part because of Ebenezer Jr.'s overspending, and in part because Ebenezer Jr.'s youngest brother, Jason, is tried, convicted, and hanged for murder. So in one generation, they ruin the reputation and the fortune. So the next generation, three of Ebenezer Jr.'s daughters, Prudence, Sally, and Nancy, never get married, never move out, never have any kids. And they end up selling a lot of their father's land holdings just to make ends meet and to pay off the debts that he still had when he passed away. So by the time they're done, there are only 2 acres left. And then when they leave the house to their niece, Rebecca, there's still the 2 acres, and it stays that through her whole time living in the house. She moves out in 1904. The house becomes a museum. Our first curator, Henry Irving Fairbanks, was both delightfully eccentric and independently wealthy, which is a great combination when you're founding a museum. And he decided 2 acres wasn't enough. He bought the property next door, brought us back up to the just under 4 acres that the house sits on today. And then he had the Sears bungalow built in 1912. So anyway, so you can see the acreage that the family owned changed quite a bit over the years. And I should note, while those 12 acres were originally one contiguous plot, the most we ever see as one plot around the house is about 50 acres. The rest of this is spread out throughout Dedham. Because back then they had no way to convert land to do what they wanted it to. So if you want to grow apples, you need a hilly area. You want to grow flax, you need low marshland. So you buy the low marshland or you buy the hills. You don't try and make the land that you already own do that. So while around 50 acres was always around the house, they owned other plots of land all over Dedham. And of course in the 1600s, Dedham was much bigger. Pretty much everything that is today Norfolk County was originally Dedham. So everything south of West Roxbury and north of Rhode Island was the town of Dedham at that point. Including actually Rentham. Rentham was a neighborhood of Dedham when John left his Rentham farm to his oldest son, John. So anyway, so to work all that land, you need 2 things above all else: horses and oxen. These are your best tools. Everything else you do requires these doing the heavy lifting and pulling, literally. So you usually have a pair of oxen, both pulling your carts with a yoke like this. And we know the family had one or 2 horses at any given time, and that's for going into town for lighter loads. You can see like this, we know the Fairbanks owned a pack saddle, specifically for loading goods on the horse's back rather than riding the horse. So they're moving goods into town to sell, they're moving goods maybe even to Boston to sell. But that's what you need to work your farm. And the other main tool you need is stuff like this. These are in the house. This is a large hay fork, and then a more, what we still see as a pitchfork today. This is what you need to run your farm. But what are we growing? A lot of different things. Apples are probably the biggest crop. We'll get into why in a moment. Wheat and other stuff like that doesn't grow very well in New England. Rye, however, grows very well. So that's the main bread, is rye bread in the 1600s. Eventually they figured out how to grow wheat and other stuff up here, but initially rye is your only real source. Of course, rye has the hazard of ergot poisoning, which is not pleasant. Probably why they looked into starting with wheat and other things. Ergot, it's a kind of fungus, and ergot poisoning causes a lot of different issues. In fact, some people, this has mostly been disproven, but this is what ergot causes enough issues that some people tried to blame the Salem witch trials on ergot poisoning. because it can cause hallucinations, paranoia, that kind of thing, among all the other weird stuff ergot poisoning does. But it's a fungus that grows exclusively on rye, and cooking the rye doesn't kill the ergot. So if it's in the rye, it stays in the rye, which would make rye bread potentially very hazardous. Other things, they grew pumpkins and other squashes, beans, cabbage. They did have cucumbers, which almost inevitably were pickled. Of course, anything on this list got pickled. That's the only way to preserve things, right? We don't have refrigeration, so anything could get pickled. Peas, onions, chestnuts were the most popular kind of nut. They grew well up here. Actually, chestnuts were once one of the most popular snack items. So if you go try and eat chestnuts today, you probably wonder why these things were so popular, because you're not eating the chestnuts they're eating. The chestnuts, they were apparently much sweeter, much more flavorful, but that strain of chestnuts died off in the 1800s entirely, completely wiped out. So you have chestnuts roasting on an open fire, all that kind of thing. Yeah, modern chestnuts don't taste as good as the chestnuts they were eating, which is sad. Actually, the same thing's true of bananas, but they didn't have those in colonial Massachusetts. But anyway, so also carrots, grapes, they were already trying to make wine. You don't make grape wine out of grapes you grow in New England, but you can still do it. And then the maize and other stuff like that they got from the Native Americans, which they converted into what we now call corn. Livestock included all the standards: cows, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens. But then we also have all this stuff that we would just find wild back then. Turkey, ducks, deer, fish, particularly cod. Cape cod is called that because of the abundance of codfish that were available in the area. And eventually there becomes an entire industry around just fishing cod in that area. And so they named my area after it. Cranberries grow wild around here, blueberries, raspberries, strawberries. There are rabbits, raccoons, possums, squirrels, and if you know what you're doing, mushrooms. But if you don't, those are pretty dangerous. So yeah, we had a lot of the same stuff we have today, but certain things you may notice aren't here yet. Plants like broccoli and cauliflower hadn't been developed yet. Fruits that grow in tropical areas, they haven't figured out how to bring them up here yet, so no oranges, no bananas. The potatoes are around, but they're not major staple crop for New Englanders at this point. They're going to be here by the 1700s, but in the 1600s, not really yet.
Does the house have like a water source near there?
Yes, there was a well actually right next to the house. So if you go to the Fairbanks House, you will see a well in front of the house.
Any pond or a little river or anything near?
Yeah, there's also a river near there, and if you go about less than a quarter mile away is Wigwam Pond,
Okay.
which was called that because before the settlers got there, the natives would set up their wigwams around that pond. It was a major campsite for the Massachusetts Native Americans. And actually we have found on the Fairbanks site artifacts that suggest the Massachusetts used that exact spot. Unfortunately, the Massachusetts were particularly hard hit by the smallpox the settlers brought with them. And so by the time the Fairbanks get there are almost no Massachusetts left. So that is not used space, so the Fairbanks and other Dedhamites can just move in. Which of course is what happened in Plymouth and other places too. Which they viewed as divine providence. Oh look, this perfectly clear land is just here waiting for us. Oh well. So here we have, the well is actually just off this picture, it's like right here. Today the well is about 5 feet tall, but based on older photographs and pictures, that was something that was modified when the house became a museum. Before that, the well was only about a foot tall, and by the 1800s it had a pump. A foot-tall well is great if you're trying to get water out of it, not so great if you're running a museum and don't want anybody falling into your well. So I think what happened is in 1904, when it became a museum, they upped the sides of the well to what it looks like today, so that's why it's this big, tall well next to the house. And actually, the water table has changed enough, probably because of all the houses built around it. I mean, you can see one there. All those houses changed the water table, and now that well's dry anyway. I wanted to show you this. This is an exterior entrance into the root cellar. The original house only had a crawl space, but the root cellar, the east and west wings of the house both have full root cellars. And those served the same purpose a modern refrigerator does. Anything you want to make sure it stays cool, it goes into the root cellar. So the main things they're going to be storing in this root cellar, based on the records we have, the main things that go in the West Wing root cellar are apples and cider and meat. Well, most of the other vegetables and stuff get stored in the East Wing's root cellar.
Do they have access to the root cellar from inside?
Yeah, so this the East Wing only has access from inside the house, and then the West Wing has a door inside and a door outside. So actually, another record suggests the cider press would have actually been on this lawn right here, right outside the root cellar. So you'd press the cider and it could go straight into the root cellar to age. And actually, pressing apples was a big deal. Johnny Appleseed, if you're familiar with it, it's a real guy, not just a legend. But Johnny Appleseed was not planting all those apples so he could eat them. He was planting all those apples so he could turn them into hard cider. Specifically hard cider. Now the thing is, everybody drank, even children were drinking alcohol back then, because if you drink water, it would make you sick. If you're lucky, it could actually kill you. They didn't understand how to purify water. But they did know that you could drink tea, you could drink rum, you could drink beer, you could drink cider. All those things are fine to drink, but water is not okay. They didn't understand the boiling process involved in all of those was what was making it okay to drink. They just knew tea and beer are okay, water not. And so most people drank alcohol just because they had to. That was the only option. And so up here in New England, the things to make beer don't grow very well. Wheat, hops, barley, none of that grows well up here. Apples grow really well in New England. So that's what Johnny Appleseed and others like him were planting all those apple trees for, is so we could turn those apples into hard cider so that we had something that we could drink year-round that wouldn't go bad and wouldn't make us sick. So that was one of the most popular drinks in New England. And then, of course, that and tea are the two big ones. But the other very big one was rum, actually. Massachusetts, New England and Massachusetts in particular, were actually in the 16 to 1700s the largest producers of rum in the English Empire. Yeah. And they were specifically part of the triangle trade. This is an example from Newport. I couldn't find one from Boston, but it's the same idea. So you have slaves, Africans captured in West Africa, are shipped to the West, what they call the West Indies or the Caribbean, and there they're forced to harvest sugarcane. The sugarcane is then shipped up to New England, where it is processed into rum. And then that rum either is sold to all the colonies, back to England, to other parts of the empire, but a large part of it goes back to Africa to be traded for more slaves. And that is the triangle trade. And so while Massachusetts will eventually be the first of the colonies to make slavery illegal, before that they are very much profiting from slavery. It's part of the economy, and part of where our fortunes come from in this area. So the triangle trade was really what maintained large parts of the British Empire, not just us, but large parts of the British Empire through most of the 17 and into the very early 1800s. So yeah, we made a lot of rum. We also drank a lot of rum, and drank a lot of cider and stuff like that. What we didn't drink, though, and actually one guy who didn't really drink at all, was Samuel Adams. He didn't like drinking. He only drank small beer, which is what they call beer, with beer meant for children, is beer cut with water. So the alcohol content was still high enough to make the water okay, but it was diluted beer, and it was meant for children. And that's the only thing Samuel Adams would drink that was alcoholic.
And now he's a big beer company.
Yeah, exactly. And now there's a beer company named after him for some reason.
It's not even him on the picture.
Yeah, the picture on the side of the bottle is Paul Revere.
Do they know that?
Oh yeah. If you've ever seen a portrait of Samuel Adams, you would not drink beer with his face on the side. And they knew that. And so Paul Revere's a much more attractive guy, so they went with him.
Oh my god, that is so funny.
Anyway, So cider's not the only thing we make. By the 1700s, the family also owns about 12 cows. And each cow produces 4 to 5 gallons of milk a day. Now, milk doesn't last back then. You have no pasteurization, no refrigeration. Your milk lasts in the warmer months 24 hours, if you're lucky. In the colder months, you might make it 48 hours before your milk goes bad. So they need to do something with all that. So 12 cows, 4 gallons each. That's a lot of milk. What are you doing with it? Well, you don't keep it as milk and let it go bad. First thing you do is scrape off the cream from the top, and the cream goes into something like these. This is called a butter churn. And this is sort of a later version of a butter churn that uses a crank instead of the paddle that goes up and down. And so you can see the original butter churn. If you take off the lid, you look down, the stick has a paddle at the bottom of it. And you just fill this with cream, and then you agitate it for several hours. This amount of cream would take a while. And eventually it turns into whipped cream. But then if you keep going, all of a sudden all the liquid comes out of it, and now you have butter and buttermilk. And you pour off the buttermilk, and if you're lucky, you make pancakes with it. And then the rest of it is butter, which you use for everything back then. Add a little salt to the butter so it lasts longer, and that'll last a while, and that'll make things delicious. Which is good because Puritans didn't like over seasoning things, so tended to be things like butter might be your only seasoning on some things. This is a later version of the butter churn. Same general idea, but a lot of the manual labor is removed. So now you have the crank that turns these things, which turn the butter, does the same thing, a lot less work on your part though. The rest of that milk you're going to turn into cheese. So here we have some medieval woodblock print of cheese making, very simplified version. But what you do to make cheese is, the first thing you do is you have a big vat of milk, and you add something called rennet to the milk. And rennet is actually made from is something that's found in the stomachs of sheep and cows. Because specifically baby sheep and baby cows, lambs and calves, thank you. Lambs and calves. Because that's what they do, is they digest milk, right? So you get those enzymes that digest milk in the calf's stomach, and they do the same thing to the milk in the bucket, and they curdle the milk. So the milk separates, you add the rennet, and the milk separates into curds and whey. So if you remember little Miss Muffet sitting on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey, why she would do that? Curds and whey is disgusting. Anyway, in fact, you don't want the whey. So what you do is, now you have your curdled milk, you let it sit for like an hour or so, your milk curdles, separating the curds and the whey. You take this weird basket-looking thing, put it over another large bucket, you line it with something called cheesecloth, which is a very loose knit cloth, and then you pour your curdled milk into the basket. The whey drains through the cheesecloth, and you're left with just the curds in the basket. That whey, there's really only 2 things to do with it. You can pour it on your plants, helps them out, but the pigs will eat it, because the pigs will eat anything. So you give them, it's high protein, but it doesn't taste good, so only pigs will eat it, so you give it to them. The Fairbanks did have pigs, so I'm sure that's where all that whey went. Anyway, you're left with the curds, but they're still fairly large. It won't make very good cheese. So you then run them through this thing. This is called a curd grinder. So you push the curds in there, turn the crank, and it breaks up the curds into smaller and smaller bits. And then they fall out the bottom into yet another bucket. And then those small curds are what you then put into a cheese mold, like these ones. You wrap them in more cheesecloth, put them in the cheese mold, and then the mold goes into the cheese press, and it pushes out the rest of the whey. You leave the large wheel of cheese in there for as much as 24 hours, pushes out all of the whey, you get a nice dry solid block of curds. Isn't quite, well, it depends. If you're making the 2 kinds of cheese they were most likely to make. Farmer's cheese, what we would call farmer's cheese, they probably just called it cheese. What we call farmer's cheese would be pretty much ready to go at that point, ready to eat. But it also doesn't last long. That one you're only going to have for a month. If you want to, you press it even harder, get even more of the whey out, really dry it out. That cheese then can go in to what they had was called a cheese closet to age. And that is how you get what we call cheddar cheese. And then, so cheddar is aged a minimum of 1.5 years. Even modern cheddar you buy at the store, that cheese is at least 1.5 years old. And the good stuff is many years older than that. And so, yeah, so we have what we would call farmer's cheese or queso fresco and cheddar, are really what they're making there. But again, 12 cows, 4 gallons of milk each, they're making a lot of cheese. I mean, that suggests to me by the 1700s they are selling the cheese as part of the business. By that point, the family is moved away from woodworking and they're mostly farmers. And they're doing stuff with the cows and everything else. So this is what a typical active hall would look like in a 1600s house. So you can compare this drawing with the actual hall of the Fairbanks House. I wanted to show you this because you can see sort of the active things, all the things drying from the ceiling beams. So meats like this in the Fairbanks House, we're pretty sure they wouldn't have done that in the hall. The meats would go down in the root cellar, but not everybody had a root cellar. You don't want those in the hall if you can avoid it because they drip. Dripping all over your floor. But it doesn't matter if they drip into the root cellar. But anyway, all these other things, yeah, we know the summer beam in the Fairbanks House, you can, no, I didn't get a picture of that. But there's hooks all over the summer beam, the main beam through down the middle of the hall. There's hooks all over it, and that was for doing this, drying up vegetables and herbs and stuff. They did do some seasoning. But it's a very active room. This fire would be going 24/7, 365 days a year, the entire 260 years Fairbanks lived in the house. So if you go into the hall, you can see the ceiling is black. That's not painted. That is 260 years of soot and ash permanently staining the ceiling of the room. And so this, the mantle over the fireplace is exposed to that heat and all that all the time. This is practically fossilized. This might as well be a piece of stone at this point, after 267 years of heat. So a few things to note here. Of course, the Fairbanks were of British descent. Their favorite way to cook, put everything in a pot and boil it. That was easy. You just put everything in a pot and you literally just leave it over the fire the entire day. You don't even need to stir that often. Again, little seasoning, probably salt, but not too much else. By the 1700s, we're starting to add seasoning. We're starting to make things more interesting. 1600s, things aren't supposed to taste good because that might make you sinful and eat too much, right? So, Puritans are weird. Anyway, another way to cook things probably came along more in the 1700s. This roaster, which I think you can see here, the roaster is open in the back. So what you do is on the stick here, you put the meat, and then you get a pretty good fire going. And in the 16 and early 1700s, this fireplace is much bigger. You can see this rectangle here. It was one large open fireplace, end to end, 2 feet deeper than this part. So it's a massive fireplace. You could have a pretty big fire going. And that was shrunk down in the late 1700s. So before that, you have a big fireplace. So you want to use your roaster. Put the meat on the little stick there, push the open back of the roaster up against your large fire, and then here's this little crank that rotates the spit. You have one of your younger children sit there and rotate that. Children as young as 5 were expected to work around the house, and they did mostly menial tasks like this. Yes, they had servants, but the servants are trained. They do the more difficult, complicated stuff. Stuff like this is children's work. Like I said, children as young as 5 were expected to pull their weight, as it were, but they didn't weigh as much. Anyway, the other thing, that shrinking down that fireplace in the late 1700s gave them the opportunity to add this, what's called a Beehive Oven. And you can see from this picture, it's quite large. But it took a lot of effort to use these. It might look like your modern brick oven pizza, but it's not quite that simple. To use this, you would have to get up at 4 a.m., get your fires going, and by mid-afternoon, you were actually ready to bake something. Baking was an all-day activity. Part of why it took so long was the way they had to set it up. So you can see it's fairly large, or circular. And so what you would do is you put a big pile of wood in the middle and light it and burn it to coals, and then you push the coals to the edge of the thing, to the edge of the oven. And then you put another pile of wood, burn it to coals, push to the side, another pile of wood, burn it to coals, push to the side, until the entire circumference of that circle is lined with burning coals. And so that takes a while to make that whole circle. And so you're doing that most of the morning, and then by the afternoon, you've actually got your circle, and then the bread goes in the middle to bake. So because it's so labor intensive, you're probably going to plan out several weeks worth of bread at once and bake it all together. So you're not going to be lighting this every day. You're going to try and keep it to maybe once every week or two, and plan your baking out that way. Once everything's cooled down, like maybe a day or two later, that's another way to use the kids, is you have them climb in there and clean it out. Anyway, once you've cooked your food, how do we eat it? Well, we don't have knives and forks yet. Right up until the 1800s. What did I say?
Knives.
Oh, yeah, we do have knives, but we don't have spoons or forks. Thank you. We do have knives, but we don't have spoons or forks. Those things exist in the 1700s, but they're almost exclusively used by nobility and royalty. Your average person eats with their hands, right up until the Victorian era. And Victorians don't like touching things, so they decide it's time to use forks. But yeah, so pretty much you have a knife to cut things into smaller pieces, then you eat with your hands. So whatever gets cooked goes into large bowls or plates like these ones on the top shelf here. And we know these, at least this plate has been in the house since the 1600s. So anyway, all the food goes into large plates and goes on the middle of the table. Actually, this is the table right here, also been there since the mid-1600s. It's what's called a gate-leg table. It folds out so you can have the whole family gathers around one table, eats together. And the big meal of the day, the meal that was important, everybody ate together, and it was usually your largest meal, was actually what we would call lunch. They called it dinner. You got up in the morning, probably about 5 a.m., and you would do your chores first, a couple hours of chores. And then around 7 a.m. or so, you have breakfast. But breakfast is small. A bit of cheese, crust of bread, that's it. Maybe a little hard cider, get things going. And then the big meal, like I said, is lunch, held around noon to 2, somewhere in there. Most people, if you're not working on a farm, even if you're working at a shop in the city, your home is probably on the second story of your shop. So even people working in downtown Boston go home for lunch back then. And so that's the big meal of the day. The whole family gathers, and that's when you have all your meats and vegetables and more complicated meals. And so what happens is the whole family gathers around the big table, the food goes on plates and bowls in the middle, and then you just take handfuls of whatever you want, and it goes into something like this, or this. These are called trenchers, and that's what people ate out of. Again, completely with their hands. And even younger kids would actually have to share one of these. So.
If the food was hot though, like what makes it cheaper in hands?
Yeah, oh maybe. Yeah, or maybe they pour it out. I don't know.
Sometimes they would eat off the end of the knife. I mean, you might
You might stab it with the knife and then move it over. Yeah. Also, you're dealing with people who have a lot more calluses than we intend to, so probably hot food wasn't as bad. Anyway, so yeah, the food goes off of those into these, and then you just eat with your hands, whatever it is. Even soup, you're not going to use spoons, you're going to drink it out of the cup or out of the trencher. And then this right here is what's called a posset pot. That was the most popular dessert item in the 1600s, was called posset. And it was it was pretty much everything you would put in bread, plus beer, plus a lot of seasoning, and then it was baked, but not until it was cooked over the fire. But they didn't cook it until it turned into bread. It was still like a mush when they ate it. But if you cook it, the beer all sinks to the bottom, and all the seasoning and stuff rises to the top. So what they would do is the kids eat the top, and then when they're done, the parents get the alcoholic part at the bottom. But that was the popular dessert item of the 1600s.
Was alcoholism prevalent back then?
The people had much higher tolerance on average, because you have to drink all the time, unless you want to drink exclusively tea. You have to drink all the time. People developed a tolerance early. So alcoholism absolutely was an issue. I mean, that's what probably killed Edgar Allan Poe, several other famous people, but it might not have been as prevalent as you might think, given how much drinking they had to do.
Also, if I recall correctly, a lot of the alcohol back then was much weaker than what we
Yeah,
have
it's not going to be
modern
as
day.
strong as Even wines probably are going to top out at 8 or 9, maybe 10% rather than the full 15 a wine gets to today.
Oh, okay.
Beer, yeah, is going to be 3 or 4% rather than 5 or 6. So yeah, it's not quite as strong.
Okay.
But then you get into stuff like rum, that is that strong. But not everybody was drinking that. So a little bit about ways the food was presented. So yeah, we're eating as a family. It always happens in the hall, you know, in the space. So yeah, the table pulls out in the middle of the room, gathered chairs from all over the house. Everybody eats around the table. But guests would never be allowed to see this room, or any room of the house other than the parlor. That is the room especially set aside to entertain guests. So if we're going to feed our guests, we need to have a separate store of food over there, and that went in this. So today this is in the lean-to, and it acts as a toolbox, but it wasn't always a toolbox. We can tell that because if you look close, it was once painted, whitewashed. These hinges, the butterfly style hinges, are much more expensive style of hinge. And you can actually see it has a decorative element, sort of a scroll on the top. This was at one point in the 1600s one of the nicest pieces of furniture in the entire Fairbanks house. And it was the cupboard where they stored food they were going to serve to guests. But years and years of use wore it out, beat it up. It was no longer nice enough for the parlor, but being Puritans, waste not, want not, gets moved into the lean-to. They had some straps on the side over here, had some hooks on the side. Now it's a tool chest. But in the 1600s, this was the nice cupboard for the nice food. And then by the 1800s, the house was much bigger and a bit divided. So now, while the main meal of the day, that lunch, is going to still be over in the hall for everybody, breakfast and then later supper, or for parts of the family, are going to be done on the smaller side fireplace over in the east wing. So you actually, by the 1800s, we have 2 fireplaces capable of cooking. But you can see much smaller. You're not going to cook a lot here, right? This is just for a little something for breakfast, a little something for supper. Not the big meal of the day. That's still going to be over in the hall. So what happened to all this? Well, farms started getting bigger. So like I said, the first few generations of Fairbanks were woodworkers. They made their money off of building things like spinning wheels and other turned wood objects. As the generations progressed, they became less and less woodworkers and more farmers. And by the time we get to the mid-1700s and Ebenezer Fairbanks Sr. is in charge, he's pretty much exclusively a farmer. But then remember I showed you that chart earlier, Ebenezer Jr. overdoes it. More than doubles the size of his father's land holdings. And so Ebenezer Fairbanks Jr. Ruins the family's fortunes by overexpanding and by diversifying at an era where that's a bad idea. So the turn of the century, the 1700s going into the 1800s, is sort of an early version of the Industrial Revolution, and where farmers are starting to specialize. So for the 1600s, most of the 1700s, everybody grew a little of everything, right? One farmer would grow apples, would grow wheat or rye, would grow squash, would grow all these other things, would have cows, chickens, pigs. One farmer would have all of that. It was around 1800 that they started specializing. This guy grows apples, this guy grows pigs, this guy grows, whatever. When everyone else is doing that, Ebenezer Jr. keeps trying to diversify. He's trying to find new crops, trying out all these new things that maybe don't grow very well in New England, because this is a rough place to grow things. He tries out all this stuff that doesn't work. He overexpands to try it. He just doesn't keep up with the times. And that's other farms are getting bigger and bigger, but specializing, only growing one thing. The Fairbanks family goes the wrong direction. And after Ebenezer Jr., the farm shrinks fairly rapidly. Our 3 sisters don't make their living as farmers anymore. So there was a common expression for an old unmarried woman was spinster. That's because most old unmarried women in the 1800s really only had one job option, being a spinster. And our 3 sisters did just that. They brought in a loom, into the house and made their living making fabrics and quilts and blankets and that sort of thing.
And selling off the family.
Yeah, and selling off the family land. Actually, probably half of that was just to pay off their dad's debts, but yeah, the other half was to make their own ends meet. So the family, so at that point, this stops being a farm. The Fairbanks stop being a farm while everybody else goes on. So in the spirit of all that, I do want to mention, we have the Fall Festival coming up on the 30th, Sunday, 12 to 5. It's free, open to the public, and we're going to be, we have craft cider companies coming in, so you can sample the kind of stuff they would have back then, spirits, that sort of thing. But also artisans, vendors, and demos, and we have pirates and sailors, and plenty of family games and stuff like that, and a raffle. So to get a first-hand example of what the Fairbanks farm would have looked like, I recommend coming to our fall festival on the 30th. So.
And there will specifically be a reenactor there talking about 17th century foodstuffs and actually preparing food over a fire.
Oh, cool.
So that should be fun. And so that is the end of my prepared talk, but I'd be happy to answer any other questions if anybody has any.
So, how many people were in the original Fairbanks family? It seems like we need a lot of people to do all the little chores and everything.
So Jonathan and Grace, when they come over from Yorkshire, England, have 6 children, 15 to 3 years old, and they have 2 indentured servants with them. The 2 indentured servants, so the way indentured servitude worked is you effectively traded 7 years of work for passage from England. So these 2 indentured servants, Samuel Bullen and James Fales, both did their 7 years, were freed, and became upstanding members of the Dedham community.
Say Fairbanks is a pretty well-known name.
Well, it's also the name of the girl that Jason Fairbanks murdered, who is actually a direct descendant. Allegedly murdered, yeah. Was convicted of murdering, but may not have actually done. That's a whole other story. That's actually probably going to be her January talk. It's Jason. But anyway. So they came over with 2 servants and 6 kids. The 3-year-old probably couldn't help much around the house, but the rest of them could. And then as the kids grew up and moved out, they would have brought in more servants to sort of fill in the gap. But actually at its height, so when they had the East Wing in 1790, it's because not including servants, there were 15 Fairbanks living in the house. And so they probably have 2 or 3 servants also still living in the house. So it's very crowded, and that's why they had the East Wing. But that, I think, is the most people that ever lived in the house at once, was 15 plus servants.
So was the St. Paul's burial ground actually there then?
Yes, that is where the Fairbanks are buried, all of them. All 7 out of the 8 generations that lived in the Fairbanks house are buried in the same plot of land. So they didn't have embalming back then. So about 10 years after you bury somebody, there's nobody there anymore. You can use the plot again. So the Fairbanks plot was, 7 generations, all buried in the same location. Only the last 3 generations have headstones, because before that they used wooden markers, so those were long gone. But yeah, so Rebecca is the only one that lived in the house that wasn't buried in Dedham, yeah.
How were they educated? Were there any significant...
That's a good question. So Jonathan, at least the initial family we know is well educated. They were landed gentry, Jonathan's father was landed gentry, but then left no land to Jonathan. It's part of why they came over here. So he would have been well educated. We knew they knew how to read. He has a highly skilled trade that required years of apprenticeship to learn. Wood turning was not easy. And especially if you're applying it to building spinning wheels, that is a complicated thing to build, because you're using multiple skill sets. You're doing everything a wood turner does and everything a wheelwright does to make a spinning wheel. So it's not easy. In the Fairbanks state, it's probably mostly homeschooling, but again, Dedham has the first public school, or publicly funded public school anyway, in the country, right? In Massachusetts, at least. And so there's a private school in Boston before this, but yeah. Anyway, Puritans believed in education. They thought everybody should be able to read the Bible. So Massachusetts actually has by far the highest literacy rate of the 13 colonies. So Massachusetts tends to be very well educated, and that carries even to outlying towns like Dedham. It's not just Boston. All of Massachusetts is well educated.
So how old were they when they came over, the Fairbanks?
Oh, Jonathan and Grace, you mean?
Yeah.
I want to say mid to late 30s, I think.
Oh.
No, because they had a 15-year-old.
Yeah, but they got married when they were 18. So yeah, late 30s, early 40s.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, because back then people didn't live till maybe what, 70s?
Well, so interesting note on that is actually the statistic that makes it look like people only made it into their 60s or 70s is skewed by infant mortality.
Wow.
So if you made it past 5, your potential lifespan was only about 5 to 10 years less than it is now.
Oh.
If you made it past 5.
Yeah.
Or
So-
also through childbirth.
Well, yeah, and then childbirth was another thing that caused a lot of death. But yeah, if you made it through 5 and you made it through childbirth, your life expectancy was in the 70s, which is about not much less than it is today.
But all that child mortality and female mortality in births seriously skewed the averages.
Oh.
So that's kind of one of those long-standing myths that it was,
Yeah.
you only live till you were 40 years old. No, that's just the average because
Everybody,
of those
yeah.
numbers.
So
But I
if
mean,
you
that's the
remove
same,
the
the
outlier-
same as the myth that everyone was, a foot shorter. That's not true either.
Yeah.
Yeah, the average height in the 1600s is only about an inch less than it is now.
Really?
Yeah. So when you go into old houses, so there's 2 things that have led to the misconception that everybody must have been short back then. Ceilings are low in 1600s houses, right? Not just the Fairbanks house, any old house you go, first period house you go in, the ceilings are really low. And when you get to the beam in the center of the room, you need to duck under it. There's 2 reasons for that. One, it required less materials to build a shorter house. And 2, they understood at least basic physics, and they understood that heat rises. So the less ceiling, less overhead you have, the easier it is to heat the room, right? And so they made the ceilings low. The other thing is that older beds, 1600s beds, are really short. So people saw short beds, short ceilings, everything must have been short. But the thing is with the beds, they thought sleeping stretched out, like everyone does today, was bad for you. The upper classes slept propped up on pillows, and the lower classes would sleep in the fetal position. So nobody needed the full-length bed we use today. They made the bed shorter, because again, less materials, less cost. So you have short beds and short ceilings. Everybody must have been short back then. Not exactly. Yeah, so.
So I'm assuming upstairs is where the bedrooms were in the Fairbanks house?
Actually, the Jonathan Grace's bed would have been in the parlor, the room where they entertained guests. But then the children's bedroom would have been upstairs. Yeah.
And did they have fireplaces in all their bedrooms?
Yeah, well, yeah. There's 3 fireplaces off the main chimney. So in the hall, the parlor, and the parlor chamber all have fireplaces. But the room over the hall was the workshop, and that didn't have its own fireplace. That was never a bedroom. And then the garret, where the servants live, never had its own fireplace. But because heat rises, and because all those rooms below are always being heated, it was never too cold up in the garret. Actually, the worst part would probably be in the summer when it's really hot up there. Servants might even sleep outside in the summer months, because I can't imagine the garret being comfortable in the summer months.
Though also keep in mind, the 1600s and into the early 1700s, there was a mini ice age.
Yeah.
Temperatures were 10 to 15 degrees colder than they are now.
Really?
Yeah.
So it didn't get up to 100 in the summer. It got up to 85.
So it's interesting, you always see, if you see a reenactor, they're wearing like 3 layers. It's a shirt, a vest, and a jacket. And then the women are wearing these really big dresses and stuff. So the average temperature never made it over 80 degrees when people are dressing like that. So when you have a modern reenactor go out in 90-degree weather dressing like that, they're doing something that those people never would have had to do. In fact, there was one day during the entire American Revolution that the temperature got up into the 90s, and it killed half the American army that day, and half the British army. But like half the people trying to fight in that weather died because they're all wearing 3 layers of wool in 95 and 100-degree heat. and yeah, it killed half the army. But that's like the only, like one of very few recorded times of the temperature getting anywhere significantly above 80 degrees anytime in the 1700s. Because yeah, a major volcanic eruption in the South Pacific, I think, actually, yeah, dropped the global temperature 10 degrees. Any other questions? Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the talk. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the presentation.
Back in for the next
All right,
one.
yep. Well, hopefully,
Yep.
hopefully we'll see you guys a week from Sunday at the festival, and then we'll see you back here on October 18th for the Ghost Tour talk.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.